and welcome to my GAMMANS YouTube channel. This week I've got something a little bit different for you again. So it's going to be a detailed piece, which basically means I'm going to film and talk about the specific, very intricate parts of each painting. So you can see really close up how I do all the little detailed areas. As per usual, I really hope you enjoy the video, and thanks in advance for watching. So here is the finished piece, and there's a little close up so you can see some of the detail before I show you exactly how I've done it. The first thing I'm going to show you is the outlining process, which happens after I've done a lot of the back painting. So you can see the back painting here are those buildings and the bridge, and I slowly go over with a palette knife to add texture and some vibrancy, and then I go over with a squeezy bottle filled with paint, which really allows me to get those thin lines and those dots, which you can see. I say dots, but what they are is flecks of light. They're supposed to be reflections and looking like the water is just very alive with that kind of late night feeling of twinkly lights in the distance, and so that's what that's doing, and it really helps me get that thin line, especially when the pointer, which the squeezy bottle has, is really thin. So you can see me now working on the reflections. I do this with a palette knife, and the way I get that scratchy and not full set of paint but a little bit kind of rough is by just a little bit less paint, and then obviously you get a little bit of the background coming through too. I do the London Eye in much the same way and then fill it out with a brush. That's the finished piece again. The next piece I'm going to show you is a similar format, so it's still a cityscape, and that allows me to really show you the intricate details because those pieces are particularly detailed. At this stage I've done quite a lot of the back painting, so you can see that the bridge is filled in, the two bridges are filled in, and the embankment, and where the city's going to go, where the buildings are going to go, is also a really dark colour. The main area of details in the piece, which are really prominent, are the buildings in the background, because they're so important because they're going to give the piece vibrancy and life. And they're also the subject matter of the piece as well. It's London, so it's a cityscape, so the city buildings are important, but also it's going to contextualise the piece too, because you see bridges and embankment and, you know, the design of the piece, and it could be a multitude of locations, but those specific city buildings are going to really help to add context to the piece so that people instantly recognise it as being London. Even though in the grand scheme of things the buildings are going to look quite small, it's still really important to get the perspective of them right, and so they look accurate like buildings. And how I do that is I line them up with the side of the embankment and get the size right. So I look at images of London and I think, right, okay, what size are they in comparison to the embankment and to the river and the bridge and all those things. So that's really important. So there is a lot of back work going into the buildings and what it's actually going to look like in the end. I'm looking at a lot of photographs all the time, a lot of photographs I've taken, a lot of photographs from aerial views of London and my old work and things like that. Just a lot of influences combined to get an accurate portrayal of the city here. It can be quite difficult, especially when these buildings are so small and in the distance, to make them look like buildings and not just kind of lumps of colour. So what I do is I make sure to leave gaps where the angles of the buildings would be and where the sides, different sides of the buildings are. So the background colour is very dark, so it looks like the buildings are outlined, but actually I'm just leaving a gap so that it looks like you can see where the top of the building is, you can see where the sides and the corners are. So that's a really important technique as well. An idea you may be familiar with is that of distance and how to create it in a painting. So it is common practice to, as the painting gets further and further into the distance, the detail gets lesser and lesser. So I'm using a palette knife here to lessen the detail, because it's easier to get detail with a brush than it is with a palette knife, but I'm creating texture in the backdrop and still maintaining the level of vibrancy in the piece and making sure that it looks buzzy and sort of hinting at forms in the distance but not quite as detailed as they are in the foreground. So that's going to create distance too, and that's where the palette knife comes in really handy. You'll notice that I do rework the same areas over and over, and that's because the undercoat dries and then I paint on top of it and I kind of build up texture in that way and detail as well. And different tools are better for different processes. So obviously the palette knife, I've just said, is harder to create detail, but it's great to create those lines and to slather on paint to give a really nice texture. A brush is really handy for detail, so as I'm creating both those things, detail and texture, you'll see me alternate between the brush and the palette knife to create the overall look. Here I'm outlining the embankment and the side of the river with the palette knife and just building up that layer of what is supposed to be the buzzy and light-filled embankment of London, which we all know is very pretty, and there are lots of things going on. There are benches, there are trees, there are lampposts, there are the walls, all those things happening. So instead of, you know, painting each thing individually because the painting isn't big enough for that, I'm just using a palette knife to just create a hint of the busyness and the vibrancy that's going on, and I'm doing that by adding different colours as well to it. So there's a lot of pinks and yellows here too. Finally, I'm using the squeezy bottle again to outline that bridge and give it some definition and also some texture as well. As I said earlier, it's really, really useful as a tool because it allows you to be particularly meticulous with that detail and place those dots and lines exactly where they need to go, which is a lot easier with the needle fine end than it would be with a palette knife or a brush, which can be a little bit less accurate. As with the last piece, you're going to see me add those reflections in too with the palette knife and also with the brush, and also smudging with my hand as well. They're really, really important again as finishing touches to give the piece a sense of life and a sense of vibrancy. So I'm dotting around the edges because that's where those lights are going to be reflecting down into the water. Also the main sunset area, which you just saw me do, which is where I get a little fleck of white, and then I'm going to drag that down into the water because that's the central reflection of the piece. Other important areas of reflection which you've seen me do are the bridge as well, and that's really, really important because that's where the forms connect with the reflection the most obvious way. So the bottom of the bridge is really important to create those rough reflections, and also where the lights are coming down and where the bridge is reflecting the bridge behind as well is really, really important. So those reflections are central to the piece, as well as the little dotty lights that you can see me doing at the moment. Making sure that each lamppost has its own light and each bridge has its own reflective properties as well, and those twinkly lights. Finally, there's the addition of the iconic London Eye, which is going to really help to contextualise the cityscape further because we all know it's London now. And there's the final piece. So there you go, that was the really detailed parts of the painting up close and personal. I really, really hope you enjoyed the video. As per usual, please do comment and don't forget to subscribe and like the channel on your way out. Thank you.